I didn't notice when I started feeling optional. That's the part one keep coming back to. Because if someone had asked me back then whether I felt important to her, I would have said yes. I wouldn't even have hesitated. I would have said it the same way people say something they've never needed to question before. I felt chosen. That's what it used to feel like. Not in some dramatic way. Not like something she said out loud every day. Just in the way she paid attention. The way she stayed with things I said. The way conversations didn't end too quickly. The way she noticed when something about me was slightly off before I even explained it. There was a time when I didn't wonder where I stood. And because of that, I didn't think about it. Which is probably why I didn't notice when that certainty started changing. When we first met, nothing about it felt complicated. That's one of the things I remember most clearly. It felt easy to talk to her in a way that didn't happen often for me. I'm not someone who opens up quickly. I never have been. Even with people I care about, it usually takes me a while to feel like I can say things exactly the way I'm thinking them. But with her, that part happened faster than I expected. Not instantly, just earlier than usual. I remember the first week we started talking regularly. Not even dating yet. Just talking more than people usually do when they're still figuring out what they are to each other. There was an evening when I told her something small about my day. Something that wouldn't normally be worth mentioning. Just something that stayed with me longer than it should have. And she asked a question about it that made me realize she had actually been listening the whole time I was explaining it. Not just waiting for her turn to talk. Actually listening. That mattered more than I said out loud. Probably more than she knew. Because it meant I didn't have to organize what I said before I said it. I could just start. And she stayed with me while I figured out what I meant. There was another moment early on that I still think about sometimes. We were walking somewhere. I don't even remember where now. Somewhere ordinary. Somewhere that didn't matter. And I remember telling her something about my brother. Not a story I usually tell people right away. Not something serious exactly. Just something personal enough that I normally would have waited longer before sharing it. And she didn't interrupt. She didn't change the subject. She didn't make it lighter than it was. She just stayed there with me while I finished saying it. And afterward, she asked something simple. Something that made it clear she understood what part of the story mattered. That was the moment I started trusting the space between us. Not completely. Just enough to keep going. At the beginning, everything felt like that. Not intense. Not dramatic. Just steady. Reliable in a way I didn't expect. If I sent her something during the day, she answered. If I told her something I hadn't fully figured out yet, she stayed with it long enough for me to understand what I meant. If I was quieter than usual, she noticed. And because of that, I didn't spend time wondering whether I mattered to her. I just assumed I did. That assumption becomes invisible when it's there. You don't think about it. You just live inside it. There was a stretch of time when I stopped paying attention to how often she reached for me first. Not because she stopped. Just because it happened often enough that I didn't need to notice it. Sometimes she texted first. Sometimes she called. Sometimes she just asked how my day was before I had the chance to tell her anything about it. And it felt natural. Balanced. Like neither of us was carrying the connection by ourselves. I think that's what made it feel safe. I didn't feel like I had to keep anything going on my own. It was already moving. Looking back now, I think that's the part one missed the most. Not the big things. Not the plans we made, or the places we went, or the things we did together. Just the feeling that I didn't have to check whether I still mattered. I didn't have to ask myself whether I was included. I didn't have to measure how much space I took up in her attention. I was already there. The first time I noticed something different, I didn't understand what I was noticing. That's the strange part. Nothing obvious changed. There wasn't a moment when she stopped caring. There wasn't a moment when I felt ignored. There was just a conversation that ended earlier than I expected it to. We were sitting together one evening, talking the way we usually did after dinner. Nothing serious. Just the kind of conversation that moves slowly from one thing to another. And I remember starting to tell her something about work. Something small. Something I hadn't finished thinking about yet. And halfway through what I was saying, she nodded and said something like, "Yeah, I get it," and smiled. And I stopped talking. Not because she interrupted me exactly. Just because it felt like the conversation had already reached its end. Even though I wasn't finished yet. And I didn't go back to it. Because it didn't feel like there was a place to return to. That moment stayed with me longer than I expected. Not because it was serious. Just because it was new. Before that, conversations didn't end that way between us. Before that, she usually stayed with what I was saying until I finished understanding it myself. And that night she didn't. Or maybe she thought she did. I'm still not sure. After that, I started noticing smaller things. Not right away, just gradually. Like how sometimes I told her something during the day and she answered later in a way that moved the conversation somewhere else. Or how sometimes she didn't ask the second question she used to ask. Or how sometimes she said she understood something before I had actually explained it. None of those things felt important by themselves. They just felt different. And I didn't know what to do with that difference yet. So I ignored it. Or maybe I just adjusted to it. I think that's closer to the truth. There was a week when I realized I had started explaining things more quickly, summarizing instead of talking through them, giving the finished version instead of the unfinished one. And at first I thought that meant I was just getting better at communicating. More direct, more clear, more efficient. But later I started wondering if I was just trying not to take up too much space. I didn't think that at the time. Not in those words. It was more like a feeling I couldn't explain yet. Like I was making myself easier to respond to, even though she hadn't asked me to. I didn't tell her that. I didn't say, I think I'm starting to talk differently around you. Because I wasn't completely sure it was true. And I didn't want to name something I didn't understand yet. So I kept talking the way I had started talking. Shorter, cleaner, easier to finish. There was one evening when I caught myself waiting for her to ask something she used to ask all the time. I told her something about my day. Something that mattered more than I admitted while I was saying it. And she nodded. And the conversation moved somewhere else. And I kept waiting for her to come back to it. Not right away. Just eventually. The way she used to. But she didn't. And that's when I noticed something clearly for the first time. I was waiting to be invited to continue. And I hadn't needed that invitation before. After that, I started paying attention to how often I waited. How often I paused before saying something else. How often I decided not to finish something because it already felt complete in her mind. Even if it wasn't complete in mine yet. And I didn't like noticing that. Because it made something else clearer. Something I hadn't been ready to admit yet. I was starting to adjust how much space I took up. Without anyone asking me to. After I noticed that, I started paying attention to things I hadn't paid attention to before. Not to her exactly. To myself. To how often I waited before saying something. How often I stopped halfway through a thought because it already felt like enough had been said. Even when it hadn't. That part surprised me the most. Because I wasn't someone who usually stopped in the middle of what I meant. If something mattered to me, I usually finished it. At least with people I trusted. And I trusted her. Or I thought I did. I still think I did. That's what made the change hard to understand while it was happening. Because nothing about the way she treated me looked wrong from the outside. She still asked how I was doing. Still told me about her day. Still made plans with me. Still showed up when she said she would. There wasn't anything I could point to and say, that's where it changed. It was more like the space between things started feeling different. There was a night when we were sitting on her couch the way we usually did. The TV was on, but neither of us was really watching it. We were talking the way people talk when they're comfortable with each other. Small things. Pieces of the day. Nothing serious. And I started telling her something about my dad. Not a big story. Just something that had stayed with me longer than I expected after a phone call earlier that week. Halfway through what I was saying, she nodded and said, "Yeah, that makes sense." And I stopped again. The same way I had stopped that earlier night when I was talking about work. And this time I noticed it while it was happening. I noticed the exact moment I decided not to continue. Because it already felt like enough had been said for her. Even though it wasn't enough for me. And I remember sitting there thinking, I guess that's all I needed to say. Even though it wasn't. Even though there was more. And that thought stayed with me longer than the conversation did. After that, I started noticing something else. It wasn't just that I stopped finishing thoughts. It was that I started choosing which thoughts were worth finishing. Before that, I didn't do that with her. If something came to mind, I said it. If something mattered, I explained it. If something confused me, I talked through it. But now there was a step in between. A quiet decision. Does this belong here? Does this fit in the conversation the way it's moving right now? And if the answer felt uncertain, I didn't say it. There was an afternoon when that became especially clear. We were texting during the day like we usually did. Not constantly. Just enough that it felt like we were still part of each other's day. I started typing something about my brother. Something small he had said to me that morning. Something that stayed with me longer than it should have. I wrote the message. Looked at it. And then I deleted it. Not because it was too personal. Not because I didn't want her to know. Just because I wasn't sure it fit anywhere anymore. That surprised me. Because before that, I never asked myself whether something fit. If it mattered to me, it already belonged. I didn't say anything about that either. I didn't say, I think I'm starting to hold things back. Because I wasn't sure I was. Or maybe I was, but I didn't know how to explain why. And nothing felt broken. That's what made it confusing. We still laughed. Still spent time together. Still talked every day. If someone had looked at us from the outside, they wouldn't have seen anything missing. I think that's part of why I stayed quiet about it. Because I didn't know how to describe something that didn't look like a problem. There was one evening when I noticed something else. We were walking somewhere together. I don't remember where now. Just somewhere ordinary. And she was telling me about something that had happened at work. Something that bothered her more than she expected. And I listened. The way I always did. I stayed with what she was saying. Asked her what part of it stayed with her the most. Asked her what she thought it meant. And she kept talking longer than she usually did. She explained things she hadn't explained at first. Came back to details she thought she had already finished. And I stayed there with her while she figured it out. And when she finished, she looked relieved. Like something had settled. And I remember realizing something in that moment that I hadn't been ready to see before. She still needed that kind of listening. The kind she used to give me. And I was still giving it to her. Without hesitation. Without deciding whether it fit. Without wondering if it was too much. And that's when I started understanding something I hadn't said out loud, even to myself yet. I wasn't taking up the same space anymore. It didn't happen all at once. It wasn't like I suddenly became quiet. It was slower than that. More like I started stepping slightly to the side in conversations without realizing I was doing it. Letting things end earlier. Letting topics move on before I was finished with them. Letting her decide what parts mattered without meaning to. And once I noticed that pattern, I started seeing it everywhere. In how I answer questions. In how often I waited before adding something else. In how often I said, yeah, it's fine, when something wasn't completely fine. Not because I wanted to hide anything. Just because it didn't feel like there was room for more. There was a night when she asked me how I was doing. The way she always did. And I answered the way I had started answering more often. I said, I'm good. And she smiled. And the conversation moved somewhere else. And I remember sitting there thinking, there was more I could have said. Not something dramatic. Just something real. Something unfinished. Something that used to belong between us. And I didn't say it. Not because she stopped me. Just because I didn't expect it to stay there long enough to matter. And that's when I started understanding something more clearly than before. I wasn't just adjusting what I said. I was adjusting what I expected to be heard. After I noticed that, I couldn't really stop noticing it anymore. That's what happens sometimes. You see something once, and then it keeps showing up in places you didn't recognize before. Not in a dramatic way. Just in small moments that start to feel connected to each other. Like when she would ask me what I wanted to do that weekend, and I would say, whatever you feel like. And at the time, I thought that meant I was being easy to be with. Flexible. Open. But later I started wondering if it meant something else. If it meant I had already stopped expecting my preference to matter as much. I didn't think that then. Not clearly. It just felt easier to let her decide. Easier to follow what the day was already becoming. There was one evening when I noticed something that stayed with me longer than I expected. We were making plans for dinner. Nothing important. Just deciding where to go. And I remember suggesting one place. Not strongly. Just something I mentioned. And she said, maybe somewhere else. Not dismissive. Not rude. Just different. And normally I would have suggested another option. Or explained why I liked the first one. Or stayed with the decision a little longer. But that night I just said, yeah, that works. And the conversation moved on. And later, while we were sitting there eating, I realized something about that moment. It wasn't that I didn't care where we went. I just didn't expect my suggestion to stay part of the conversation. So I let it go before it even had a chance to be. That started happening in other places too. Not just with plans. With stories. With opinions. With small things that used to belong to both of us equally. I would start saying something, and then adjust the way I said it halfway through. Or I would decide not to say it at all. Not because she told me not to. Just because I already knew where the conversation would probably go. And it felt easier to move there first instead of waiting for it to happen. There was a night when I almost told her that. Not exactly like that. Just something close. We were sitting together after dinner again. Talking the way we usually did. Quietly. Comfortably. And I remember thinking, I feel like I'm starting to take up less space around you. The thought surprised me. Because I hadn't said it that clearly to myself before. It had been there in pieces. In smaller moments. In things I noticed, but didn't connect. And suddenly it felt like a sentence. Something I could actually say. Something she might understand. And I almost did. I really almost did. But then another thought came right after it. What if she doesn't see it that way? What if nothing feels different to her at all? And I didn't know how to explain something that only existed inside my experience of us. So I stayed quiet, the way I had started staying quiet about other things too. After that, I think I started paying attention to how often I waited for her to include me instead of including myself. That's the only way I know how to explain it now. Before that, I didn't wait. I just existed inside the conversation, inside the plans, inside the decisions, like I already belonged there. But later, I started noticing how often I checked whether there was room before I stepped into something, even something small, even something that used to feel automatic. There was one afternoon when I caught myself doing that in a way I couldn't ignore. We were texting about something ordinary, plans for later that week, nothing serious, and she suggested something, a time, a place, and I remember starting to type, that might not work for me, because I already knew it didn't. But I stopped before I finished the sentence. Not because I changed my mind, just because it felt easier to adjust my schedule instead. And I told myself that was normal, that relationships involve compromise, that this wasn't a big deal. And maybe it wasn't, by itself, but it didn't feel like compromise. It felt like I had already decided my time was more flexible than hers, without anyone saying that out loud. I started noticing something else after that. It wasn't just what I said, it was what I expected. Before that, I expected to be included automatically, not in everything, just in the same way she was included in mine. Later, I started waiting for signs that I still was. And that's a strange thing to notice about yourself, because expectations like that don't usually change without a reason. They just shift quietly, until one day you realize you're asking yourself questions you never used to ask. Questions like, does she actually want me there? Does this matter to her the way it matters to me? Is this something I should bring up? Or should I just let it go? There was one night when that feeling became especially clear. We were sitting together again. The same couch. The same quiet evening. The same kind of conversation we had always had. And she was telling me about something she was planning. Something coming up the next week. Something she sounded excited about. And I listened, the way I always did. I stayed with what she was saying, asked her questions, followed the details. And at some point I realized something. She hadn't asked if I wanted to come. Not yet. And maybe she was going to. Maybe she just hadn't gotten there. But I found myself waiting for the question, waiting longer than I expected to. And the longer I waited, the more I started feeling something I hadn't felt before. Like I wasn't automatically part of what she was describing. Like I was somewhere just outside it. And when the conversation moved somewhere else without that question happening, I told myself it probably didn't mean anything. That maybe it wasn't the kind of thing I was supposed to be included in. That maybe I was reading too much into it. But the feeling didn't leave. It stayed there quietly, long after the conversation ended. Because for the first time, I noticed what it felt like to be present with someone, and still feel slightly optional. That feeling didn't go away after that. It didn't get stronger right away either. It just stayed, quietly, like something I kept noticing in small places I hadn't noticed before. Not because anything dramatic happened, just because once you feel something like that once, it becomes easier to recognize it again. There was a morning when she mentioned plans she had made for the weekend. Not plans with me, just plans. Something she was looking forward to. Something she told me about the same way she told me about other things in her life. And I remember listening the way I always did. Nodding, asking questions, staying inside the conversation with her. But somewhere in the middle of what she was saying, I realized something. She hadn't asked what I was doing that weekend. Not yet. And I waited for her to. Not in an obvious way, just quietly. The way you wait for something that usually happens without thinking about it. And when the conversation moved somewhere else without that question coming, I told myself it didn't mean anything. That people forget to ask things sometimes. That maybe she already assumed I had plans. That maybe it just wasn't important that day. And all of those explanations sounded reasonable, which is probably why I kept using them. I think that's what I did most during that time. I explained things to myself. Not because I was trying to ignore what I was feeling, just because I didn't know what else to do with it. It didn't feel big enough to bring up. It didn't feel clear enough to name. It just felt like something slightly different than before. And I kept adjusting to that difference instead of asking about it. There was one evening when I caught myself doing something I hadn't done before. She asked me what I wanted to do that night. And instead of answering right away, I waited. Not because I didn't know. I knew exactly what I wanted to say. I just wanted to see what she suggested first. And when she did, I agreed with her, even though it wasn't what I had been thinking. And later I realized something about that moment. I hadn't waited because I didn't have an opinion. I had waited because I wasn't sure mine mattered in the same way anymore. And that realization stayed with me longer than I expected. After that, I started noticing how often I followed her plans instead of bringing my own into the conversation. Not because she asked me to, not because she ignored mine, just because it felt easier. Easier to stay where the conversation already was. Easier to move with what she wanted than to introduce something else. And at first that felt like flexibility. Like something good. Like something people do when they care about each other. But after a while, it started feeling like something else. Like I was stepping slightly out of the center of things without realizing I was doing it. There was a night when that became clearer than before. We were sitting together again, talking about something she was planning later that month. Something she sounded excited about. And I remember listening carefully, asking questions, staying with what she was saying. And at some point I noticed I hadn't said anything about whether I wanted to be part of it. Not because I didn't, just because I was waiting for her to ask. And she didn't. And I didn't say anything either. And the conversation moved somewhere else. And afterward, I kept thinking about that moment longer than I expected to, because I realized something I hadn't said out loud, even to myself yet. I was waiting to be included, instead of assuming I already was. That's a strange shift when it happens. It's not something you decide. It's something you notice after it's already been happening for a while. Before that, I never wondered whether I belonged inside her plans. I just assumed I did. Not because she said so every time. Just because that's how it felt between us. Later, I started waiting for confirmation. And once you start waiting like that, something changes, even if nothing else does. There was one afternoon when I almost told her what I was noticing. Not exactly like that, just something close. We were sitting across from each other at a table somewhere, talking about something ordinary. And I remember thinking, I feel like I'm starting to stand just outside of things. The thought surprised me, because it sounded clearer than anything I had said to myself before. Like something I could actually explain. Like something she might understand if I said it out loud. And I almost did. I really almost did. But then I thought, what if this is just me? What if nothing feels different to her at all? What if I say this, and it turns something small into something bigger than it needs to be? And I didn't want to do that. So I stayed quiet again. The way I had started staying quiet about other things too. After that, I think I started noticing how often I made myself easier to include, instead of assuming I already was. That's the only way I can explain it now. Before that, I didn't adjust my place in things. I just existed inside them. Later, I started checking where I fit, even in small moments, even in conversations that used to feel automatic, even in plans that used to feel shared. And once I noticed that happening, I couldn't stop noticing it, because it kept showing up, in how I answer questions, in how often I agreed before I suggested something else, in how often I waited instead of speaking first. And slowly, without deciding to, I started feeling like I was still there, still part of the relationship, still included, but not in the same way as before, not in the way that felt automatic, not in the way that felt certain, more like someone who was present, and still slightly optional at the same time. After I started noticing that feeling more clearly, something else changed too, not in the relationship itself, in how long I stayed quiet about what I was noticing. Because for a while, even after I understood what was happening, I didn't think that meant anything had to change. That's the strange part. Realizing something isn't always the same as acting on it. Sometimes it just becomes something you carry around for a while. And I carried it longer than I expected to. From the outside, everything still looked normal. We still saw each other. Still talked every day. Still made plans. Still laughed in the same places we always laughed. If someone had asked me then whether something was wrong between us, I probably would have said no. Not because nothing had changed, just because nothing had broken. And that difference matters more than people realize. Something can feel different without feeling broken. And when that happens, it's hard to explain why anything needs attention at all. So I stayed. Not because I didn't notice what I was feeling, just because I didn't know what I was supposed to do with it. There was a night when that became especially clear to me. We were sitting together after dinner again, talking the way we usually did, quietly, comfortably. And she asked me what I wanted to do that weekend. And I remember noticing something strange before I answered. I waited, not because I didn't know what I wanted, just because I wanted to see whether she already had something in mind. And when she did, I said yes, even though it wasn't what I had been thinking about. Not because I didn't care, just because it felt easier to move with what she wanted than to introduce something else. And that's when I understood something I hadn't admitted to myself yet. I had started treating my place in the relationship like something flexible, something that adjusted around hers, without either of us ever saying that out loud. After that, I started noticing how often I did that. How often I stepped slightly to the side without meaning to. How often I followed instead of suggesting. How often I agreed before I explained what I was thinking. And the strange part was, she never asked me to do that. That's what made it confusing. Nothing she said told me to become quieter. Nothing she did made me feel unwanted. It was just the space between us that had changed. And I had adjusted to it before I understood why. There was one evening when I almost told her everything I had been noticing. Not dramatically, not as a complaint, just as something I was trying to understand. We were sitting next to each other on the couch again. The same couch where we had spent so many evenings before, talking about something ordinary. And I remember thinking, I think I'm starting to feel like I'm not automatically part of things anymore. The sentence stayed with me longer than I expected, long enough that I almost said it out loud. But then another thought came right after it. What if she doesn't see it that way? What if this only exists in how I'm experiencing things? And I didn't know how to explain something that didn't have a clear moment attached to it. So I didn't say anything. The way I hadn't said other things. The way I had started not saying things more often. After that, I stayed longer than I probably should have. Not because I was waiting for something to change, just because everything still worked in the ways that were easy to see. We still cared about each other, still showed up, still talked, still planned things. And when something still works like that, it's hard to tell yourself something else is missing, even when you can feel that it is. There was a week when I realized I hadn't suggested anything we should do together. Not once. Not a restaurant. Not a plan. Not even something small. And I didn't notice that while it was happening. I noticed it afterward, when I tried to remember the last time I had said, what if we did this? And I couldn't. That surprised me more than I expected. Because before that, suggesting things together had been automatic. Something I didn't think about. Something that belonged to both of us. And now it didn't feel that way anymore. There was another night when she asked me how I was doing. The same way she always had. And I answered the way I had started answering more often. I said, I'm good. And she smiled. And the conversation moved somewhere else. And I remember sitting there thinking, there's more I could say. Not something serious. Just something real. Something unfinished. Something that used to belong between us. And I didn't say it. Because I didn't expect it to stay there long enough to matter. And that's when something inside me felt especially clear. I wasn't just adjusting what I said. I was adjusting what I expected to be heard. After that, the relationship didn't end all at once. There wasn't a single conversation where everything changed. There wasn't a moment where we both understood something at the same time. It became quieter than that. Less automatic. Less shared. Less certain. Until one day, I realized something simple. I was still there. But I wasn't standing in the same place anymore. Even after we stopped seeing each other the way we used to, I thought that feeling would disappear. I thought once the relationship ended, I would go back to the way I used to be. The way I used to speak without checking whether there was room. The way I used to assume I belonged inside the conversation. But it didn't happen like that. That habit stayed. There are still moments now when someone asks me what I want to do, and I notice myself waiting before I answer. Not because I don't know. Just because something in me still checks whether my answer fits first. There are still moments when I start telling someone something that matters to me, and then stop halfway through. Not because they interrupted me, just because part of me is already listening for whether there's space for it. And sometimes there is. Sometimes there isn't. But I still check. Almost every time. I think that's the part one didn't expect. Not that the relationship would change, but that the way I moved inside relationships would change with it. That something so quiet could stay with me that long, even after everything else became something I don't think about as often anymore. Sometimes I still notice myself waiting to be included, even when no one is excluding me, even when there's room, even when the conversation hasn't ended yet. And when I notice that happening, I usually don't say anything about it. I just wait a little longer. The same way I started waiting back then. The same way I didn't realize I was waiting at first. Until eventually, it started feeling normal.